Welcome and good evening from the UK time zone. You might be joining us from around the world. So it's 5 p.m. here, and it's lovely to have so many of you joining us for this webinar, which is being hosted by FFI. Um, Today's topic is on agriculture and conservation. We're going to be talking to the theme of growing wise, moving towards sustainable agriculture with FFI. Um, Let me introduce myself and then start the proceedings. I'm Bhaskar Veera. I had the privilege of spending 8 years on FFI's council and have just stepped off, having served my tour of duty. I'm still a close friend, supporter, and I'm delighted to be asked to chair this panel. In my day job, I work at the University of Cambridge, where I am the head of the Department of Geography. I also work very closely with Cambridge's interdisciplinary initiatives, and two in particular that are directly relevant to the subject of this afternoon's discussion. I've been for a very long time part of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative that FFI is also part of, and I was director of the university's Interdisciplinary Research Center in Conservation, the University of Cambridge Conservation Research Institute. I'm also very closely involved with Cambridge's Global Food Security Interdisciplinary Research Center. So pretty much the two overlapping subject areas of this evening's discussion are very close to my own personal work, and I'm really looking forward to a terrific panel that's going to help us to introduce these ideas. You might ask the question why conservationists should be interested in agriculture. I think I'll just pick out a few sort of headline figures which indicate why this is so important. Agriculture uses 40% of the world's land area. It's responsible for something like 70% of global freshwater withdrawals. And the agricultural sector and land use have been seen as responsible for up to a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. So there's no question that what we do with the land has a profound impact both on present as well as future challenges around sustainability. And environmental and conservation organizations are centrally interested in the way in which we manage the land and what we do with land. Uh, Equally, we have to recognize the importance of trying to feed what might be up to 10 billion people on the planet, and key challenges around global food security. Probably no better recognition than the fact that the Nobel Peace Prize last week was awarded to the World Food Programme, signaling the importance of finding sustainable as well as equitable ways to feed ourselves while living within the constraints of one finite Earth. So the questions that we confront in this debate are really about ways to manage the land, ways to manage supply chains sustainably, ways to find equitable ways to reward land managers for their stewardship of the land, and to recognize that that's an intergenerational commitment both to ourselves as well as those who will inherit the earth after us. How do we do this while finding ways to meet the challenges of something like 800 million people who are still undernourished? And on the flip side, almost the same number who are also diagnosed as being clinically obese. So we actually have a crisis in terms of under and overnourishment at a time when we're trying to find ways to reduce our overall global footprint on the planet and protect the last remaining wild places for all the values that we nurture so much in terms of our relationship with nature. So these are the dilemmas that my wonderful panel is going to help us to steer our way through. I've very generously been given a little bit of time to introduce the topic, but I don't want to uh, steal time away from three really outstanding participants who are going to talk to us about these issues. I'm delighted to welcome them. I'll introduce them in turn when they speak. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, Richard Walker, a member of the FFI Council and Managing Director of Iceland Food. Richard is a trustee of Iceland Food's charitable foundation and the conservation group Surfers Against Sewage. as well as an ambassador for the Wildlife Trusts and patron of the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. He sits on Number 10's Small Business Council, on DEFRA's Council for Sustainable Business, and Greenpeace's Ocean Advisory Board. In 2019, Richard was selected by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. And I think you'll all agree that we could have no better person to kick us off. So Richard, over to you, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Bhaskar, for those words, and thank you to FFI for having me. I started to become involved with FFI just over a year ago, and I must say, I found it such a fabulous organization with genuinely world-leading experts who do incredible research, often unheralded and behind the scenes, but research that and conservation work that nevertheless is just so important as we face the climate and nature emergency that we do. So it's a fabulous learning curve for me, and I feel honoured to be part of the council. So I thought I'd just kick off by giving you my take on our food system and agriculture. And I suppose, it's a take from a retailer that's very much, a mass market, high volume food retailer. And often we have these discussions at a certain level, and they're often had by people who can afford to pay more for lower impact food, organic food, ethical food, etc. And I always try and look at it from the starting point of our customers. We are a company that turns over about £4 billion a year, and we have about 5 million customers a week. And many of those customers only have about £25 a week to spend on food. Our store portfolio, we've got about 1,000 stores around the UK. That perfectly overlays with the government's areas of high deprivation. So we very much are tuned in to modern day Britain and also some of the challenges that real people face today. We also employ 28,000 people who are very much on the front line, the voice of our stores, and I have no better way of getting a pulse for what's going on across the business, but also through society, than speaking to our store colleagues around the country. The first thing I wanted to talk about really was our experiences through COVID. In many ways, we were one of the lucky ones in that we were allowed to keep trading. But of course, we were very much on the front line as the only shop open on many high streets around the UK. And of course, our store staff had no option to work from home, and they were nothing short of heroic, keeping the nation fed. We sort of experienced the best and worst of society, really. We saw unparalleled acts of community generosity and spirit. But also, we did face untold abuse and sometimes violent abuse across our stores as we were faced with this overwhelming surge in panic buying, mostly inexplicably for toilet roll. And then about 6 weeks later, people realized they only needed so much toilet roll in their life. So it was a strange period of 6 weeks, which saw our just-in-time supply chains blown to pieces, quite frankly. And it took us a week or two for our supply chains to catch up. But one of the learnings I took was the unparalleled act of collaboration that took place across the industry. Competition laws were temporarily suspended, and I had daily calls with my competitors, who normally we're at war with on a daily basis, and the government, as we came together to help feed the nation. And it was amazing how quickly we could recover and what we could achieve in terms of feeding the vulnerable, prioritizing slots for the elderly, et cetera, when we worked together. So that was one big learning. The second big learning, and I suppose this is about leadership, is that really it's the art of listening to people. And our best acts all happen from listening to people on the front line, namely our stores. One of the things I'm proudest of is that we were the first company to prioritise slots for the elderly and vulnerable. But that wasn't my idea, or indeed anyone's idea at head office. It was an idea that came from our store in West Belfast by the assistant manager there. And it was something that we rolled out quickly across our 1,000 stores and then was copied by every other retailer. But I think overall, COVID did highlight it shone a light really on just how weak and compartmentalized our food system has become, and the lack of interconnectedness really between it. We had millers, for example, who couldn't redirect their flour to the retail markets because they had shuttered wholesale markets, and they struggled to adjust their line speeds to repackage the products for the retail customer. We had strawberry growers who were forced to let their strawberries rot when Wimbledon was cancelled, and they couldn't redirect it for lots of reasons into the food retail sector. And over the pond in America, we had potato farmers in Montana and Idaho that were forced to bury billions of tons of potatoes as the wholesale markets dried up. So I think one of the big lessons, if you like, is that when we face the next shock, and that will more likely be a supply side shock that comes from potentially multiple crop failures around the world as we face into climate change, rather than COVID, which was a demand side shock. We need to be more diverse and resilient in our food system to ensure that we feed these 10 billion people in years to come that Bhaskar referenced. I'm pleased to say that, despite being a mass market food retailer, like I referenced at the start, we are embracing innovation, as are all of our competitors. And we're just about to introduce a range of vertically farmed salad that will be going on sale in our stores. And that uses minimal land. It's a very high-grade product that provides high-tech, well-paid jobs in urban areas with very short supply chains. And actually, our fastest growing category now in our stores is our no meat vegan range, which is obviously great news for the climate, amongst other things. And these aren't expensive products. And like I said, our customers don't have a lot to spend, but they are mindful of how heavily they tread on the planet, and they want to try and make an impact, particularly our younger customers. The final thing I'd say is that we don't pay enough for our food, and that's obviously difficult for me to say when we have customers who are struggling to make ends meet. But the prices of our products haven't really changed since the 1990s when I look at old adverts, and that is of course reflected in the average household spend for products, which I think is now a third in the UK of what it was in the 1950s. And yet, alongside all of this, we have inequality growing all around the world, but especially in the UK. I see almost Dickensian levels of poverty now on the high streets that I visit up and down the country. We have 4.2 million kids who live in poverty, and there's now more branches of food banks than McDonald's in the UK. So we have some real structural problems, and I think the solution to all of this with reference to our food system is really for more government intervention. And that's why I'm encouraged to see the ELMS proposal as we leave the EU, which is all around public money for public goods and trying to restore nature and climate in our farming system, but also at a community level. And we have a famous footballer called Marcus Rashford, plays for Manchester United, I'm sure many of you know. But Marcus grew up in Wythenshawe, where we have a store, and it's a very deprived community of South Manchester. And Marcus is a kid who grew up on food vouchers as a kid and benefited from free school meals. And he's done incredible work and just been recognised by the Queen actually in the birthday honours for his work in encouraging the increase in Healthy Start vouchers. And this is something where if you're on benefits, you can receive vouchers from the government, which you spend on fruit and vegetables. It's certainly something pertinent to our customer. and I'd be happy as a citizen, but also as a business, to pay more tax so that people like our customers can get access to high nutrition food, even if that is through more government intervention, because we cannot wait long enough for the free market to sort out some of these systemic structural issues all by themselves. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what I've experienced over the last couple of months, and I'll hand back over to you, Bhaskar, and happy to take questions at the end.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard, for those introductory remarks, and I'm sure we'll pick up on a number of those issues in the conversation. I think our plan is to press straight on and have our next speaker and then our final speaker, and then we'll circle around and have a conversation between yourselves as well as the audience. So I'm delighted to welcome as our next speaker, Christina Archer from UNDP. Christina has been working with smallholder farmers for nearly 30 years, starting in the development sector with Save the Children, focusing on livelihoods and food security, then transferring her skills and experience to the private sector, working with the Body Shop and L'Oreal Group on sustainable sourcing strategies and supply chain management. Since 2016, she's been working as a strategic advisor for the Sustainable Food Lab think tank and UNDP on sustainable commodities and food systems. She is also part of Unilever's Pucker Tea Mission Council and a trustee of the Innocent Foundation. Christina, look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I guess in the introduction, I should have also said I have had some fantastic links with the FFI teams over the last few years, and have worked with Michelle and other colleagues. And as Richard said earlier, coming in and getting to know FFI a bit better when I was working in the corporate sector, I was so impressed and amazed with the high quality teams they have in the field as well as head office. You know, really deep knowledge and experience, which was invaluable, especially for somebody that was managing supply chains, when you really do look for that technical expertise to help you navigate what is sometimes, you know, unfathomable kind of technical issues. Today, I want to follow up a little bit and build on what Richard said, and sort of look at the experience that I've also had over the last 6 months or so linked to COVID and the kind of things that I'm seeing in agriculture from the links that both UNDP and the Sustainable Food Lab have with private sector companies, retailers, traders, processors, international companies, as well as national companies in many countries of origin. As we've heard, and as I'm sure all of you on the call know, COVID already exposed what we knew were pre-existing challenges in unsustainable agriculture, in the pressures that we're facing. It sort of really threw up the degradation to many of the ecosystems, the soil, the water sources that agriculture and the millions of smallholders rely on. The loss of biodiversity, the increase in poverty, and these are only going to be exacerbated in the coming months. And we've heard, you know, that the trends are that there will be some severe food security issues emerging. So that has been exacerbated. But what that has prompted many governments and companies to say, is this the opportunity for us to build back better? I'm sure that many of you already have heard about the green recovery that people are talking about. How can we use this opportunity to revisit the systems, these food systems that we know are not sustainable? We know they're not equitable. How can we be working together to reboot in a way that is going to help us meet the demands of the next generation, is going to help meet in the immediate next 10 years, in the decade of action, the needs of the smallholders, and of course, obviously, you know, of supply chains and so on. It needs to be more equitable. It needs to be more sustainable. But how do we do that? So in terms of sourcing and what we're hearing the private sector say, as again, I'm sure many of you know, we already have started moving away from just do no harm in our sourcing to actually trying to have a positive impact through sourcing in a good way, through sourcing from supply chains that are looking at issues such as regenerative agriculture, are looking to protect forests. There's, really big discussions happening around the topic of living income for smallholder farmers across many commodity sectors, and within governments as well. How do we step up the protection and value of soil health, of water sources, and so on? So, we all we know there is a need to do that, and companies really see that, not only in terms of being able to secure their supply chain in the very short term, and to have a kind of, they feel they have a moral responsibility to do this, but that next generation is also something that's on a lot of people's minds. How are we protecting the assets that the next generation of smallholder farmers can use for their livelihood? How are we providing incentives for them to want to continue farming and to do farming in a good and a sustainable way? As I said, this is the decade of action. Everybody's very, very clear on that. We've got 10 years. We have the SDGs coming up. We're such a long way away, especially the ones that are linked to planetary health, the ones that are linked to hunger, the ones that are linked to poverty. So there is definitely a need to be working together on this. For companies, though, there's still been a little bit of a silo approach. I look at social issues in my supply chain. I've started looking at environmental, maybe it's forest. But now when we're thinking about building back better and we want to try and look at things in a more holistic way, then how do I look at biodiversity? What does good look like? If I'm talking about good practices for farmers, again, what does that look like? And how do I know that I'm having a positive benefit? And that's really where, for me, FFI comes in and, provides this amazing resource and ability to actually, show and demonstrate this is what good looks like. This is what protection and conservation looks like. And this is how it could link to supply chains. This is how it could link to agriculture at a national level, at a local level. And that expertise, I think, is absolutely key. A really important word, which I'm hearing a lot at the moment, is that resilience piece. So, how, and Richard obviously has referred to it already, but how do we build back better? How do we look at sustainable agriculture and agricultural systems in a way that won't only, help us over this hiccup that we've had, quite a substantial one, but how do we also, make sure that any gains that we continue to make in terms of good quality, good agricultural systems and social benefits, how do we maintain those and build on those? So how do we ensure resilience in sustainable agriculture in the future? And I think that also what we're seeing on the other side as well is governments during COVID and following COVID are also having a little bit of a rethink about what do I need to do as a government in terms of ensuring the food security of my my nation. And so where we've had serious and substantial focus being given on export crops, there might be some sort of revision of that. And I think that's also quite a good opportunity through FFI's presence and engagement in so many different countries to be able to inform that and bring in that sustainable agriculture experience that they've had. I think a last point I'd like to mention is one that I was just on a webinar a couple of hours ago, and again it came out really strongly. It was looking at the international coffee sector, and there's a lot of focus that's been given on farmers and how to work with farmers, but and how do we professionalize farmers in order to be able to withstand shocks, in order to be able to valorize their environmental assets that they have and protect them. They are the guardians of the ecosystems within which they live. But how do we also work with producer groups? And how do we create then strong enterprises that are also drivers of a resilient community, a resilient local economy? But how do we create enterprises that again are valorizing the natural assets that they have and are able to use them in a sustainable way, in a way that is also where needed, kind of regenerative? And again, FFI has some great experience on working not only with farmers, but with farmer groups and enterprises, which I think is going to be really, really important. And companies are really sort of seeing that is also a focus that they need to have. Again, the question being, how do we manage to link the social and environmental together in order to really have sustainable food systems for the future? I just wanted to sort of finish by sort of emphasizing the importance of food systems and how This is a great opportunity for us all to get engaged in the discussions happening around a new resilient food system reboot that's needed. And next year, or well, starting in a few months' time, but we see the beginning of the UN Food Summit that's going to take part next year. So there'll be plenty of opportunities to input and share experiences leading up to that. But I think I just wanted to mention that because it is indicative of how much importance everybody's placing on re-looking at our food systems. And this is a good opportunity to build back better in a more sustainable and equitable way. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. And again, I think you've raised a number of really interesting issues that I'm sure we're going to pick up on in the conversation. Let me introduce our final speaker, Michelle Villeneuve. Michelle is part of FFI's Agricultural Landscapes team. She joined FFI in 2018 as the team's technical specialist and has worked in that role closely with FFI's partners and field staff in the implementation of agricultural programming across FFI's global portfolio, with a particular focus on updating agricultural data collection systems. She's now taken on the role of Senior Program Manager for the Agricultural Landscapes team and is working closely with colleagues and senior management to ensure that FFI is equipped for the challenges that lie ahead at this agricultural conservation nexus. Prior to joining FFI, Michelle worked with organizations such as One Acre Fund, the World Fish Center, and several smaller Canadian NGOs focused on sustainable development. So both in terms of introducing us to FFI's own work in this area, as well as the larger questions, Michelle, look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Bhaskar. Yeah, I'm really excited to have a chance to speak to everyone about the work we do in agriculture at FFI. When I heard who my co-panelists were going to be, I'm just sharing my screen right now. I decided that I wanted to talk to you guys about, since we're looking at the supply chain and we started with a retailer and then sort of went through some of the supply chain concerns that Christina told us about, I decided that I wanted to talk to you guys about how FFI works with smallholder farmers. So first thing that I wanted to communicate is that smallholders produce 75% of the world's coffee, over 90% of the cocoa, 30% of palm oil, and 80% of rice. This is equivalent to a third of the global food supply, and it is farmed on a quarter of the land. I thought that was an interesting point to start with because I think that, myself included, I think we tend to think when we're thinking about agriculture and supply chains, we think of these, you know, the big guys, the big industrial actors who, you know, we think of these palm oil plantations in Borneo, but actually what we're working with when we work with smallholders looks a lot more like this. We're working with forest fragments. We're working with smallholders who live on the edges of these forest fragments. They're the stewards of these areas, but they're also trying to survive. They're trying, you know, they're smallholder farmers. They're growing food mostly to feed themselves with a little bit of extra for the market. They're usually growing on less than 2 hectares. And that brings me to the complexity. This is, as I'm sure everyone knows, a really complex topic, and that's why I decided to drill down just to smallholders. I hope that we'll talk a little bit about agribusiness in the panel discussion or perhaps in another webinar. But when it comes to smallholders, as I said, and Richard and Christina both mentioned it, smallholders are the stewards of much of the world's tropical biodiversity. They are extremely vulnerable. They are, the majority of the world's poor are subsistence or smallholder farmers. Commodity-related policy decisions have a huge impact on them. I'm not going to go into detail about COVID in my presentation today because, to be honest, it hasn't quite hit very hard in the communities that we work with. I think that it will in the future, but what does hit is, you know, things like things that are really excellent, like groups of farmers adhering to certification standards, including with FFI. But it's really important to recognize that whenever that happens, there's another group of farmers who now have less access to market because they did not have that leg up. They don't necessarily understand the quality control aspect because it wasn't explained to them. So I think it's really important to just sort of think about, you know, this is 500 million farms, 2 to 4 times that many people. So somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people that we're talking about here, which means that it's really difficult to sort of like say, okay, well, here is the solution. So I'm basically, I hope that I answer some of your questions, but I think I'm probably going to raise a lot more than I answer. So when it comes to working with smallholders and improving the sustainability of their production systems, I've decided today to focus again on just two areas. On the left, carbon emissions and the impact of smallholder agriculture on biodiversity. And then on the right, I've sort of categorized the way that we approach, the way that we design interventions into these four areas. This is not comprehensive and this is not official, but I think for today it gives a good overview. So first with carbon emissions, the general figure that goes around is around 25% or maybe up to a third of greenhouse gas emissions are the result of agricultural activity and the associated land use change. The CGIAR did a really cool study in 2017 where they tried to determine what percentage of that actually comes from smallholder production. And what they found was that about 5.1% of total emissions, not 5% of the 25%, but 5.1% of all global emissions are likely from smallholders, and that does include the associated land use change, which means that for the agricultural percentage, the leftover emission amount is industrial. The numbers are a bit confusing, but either 80% of what's left over from that 25% or 20% overall. So I want to start our discussion about emissions with this chart. Again, confusing with the numbers, agricultural production here is listed at 13% because it's only taking production into account. The land use change would account for whatever the extra amount is. As we can see here that livestock and sort of like things that are associated with livestock, a little more than 50% of emissions. Soil fertilization, referring mainly to agrochemical use and mainly in the developed world, another 20%. Energy, again, mainly in the developed world because there's not a lot of energy going into these smallholder farms. And then we have rice, which is what I want to talk about. So rice is the crop responsible for the most greenhouse gas emissions, and this is due to a bacterial fermentation process while the rice is growing in the paddy water. There are two types of rice. I'm sure there are more, but two major types. There's paddy rice, and then there's dryland or upland rice. Paddy rice, of course, is the one that has the emissions issue due to the water. It's very popular because it is easy to maintain. It is much easier to maintain than upland rice. That's literally due to the water, keeping away the weeds. And it's also, for that reason, it's more productive. So, sorry, when we have upland rice, we do have, when you move from paddy rice to upland rice, you pretty much always accept a yield decrease. One example, in Guinea, we've been working in the Ziama Man and Biosphere Reserve, which is a UNESCO site in Guinea Forestière, where farmers used to be allowed to legally cultivate there in the shallow wetlands. They used to cultivate paddy rice there, but that became illegal fairly recently. It used to just be prohibited. So now we're working with these farmers to help them transition their livelihoods outside of illegally farming paddy rice. And so we're working with a lot of them on upland rice. One really interesting result that we had was that we were able to purchase a variety of upland rice from the seed multiplication body of the government of Guinea. And this number is ridiculous and it's not normal, but I did verify it. We had a 423% yield increase through this transition. We won't have that year on year, but because of the improvements within that variety, we did see that in the first year. And I just wanted to say that because varieties are a really, really, really important part of moving forward with sustainable agriculture. In Myanmar, we have a project with rice where we're working on organic rice with the purpose of decreasing eutrophication in Lake Ndoji, also a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve and a Ramsar site. It's been extremely successful. They have achieved PGS national certification, USDA and EU organic rice certification, and farmers are very interested in joining. And of course, this is because of the extra income they get per kilo. And then finally on rice, we have soil management in Ometepe, where traditionally farmers use mycorrhizal fungus to help with improved production. The mycorrhiza describes an association basically between fungal filaments and plant roots that is really beneficial to plants. It helps with nutrient uptake, which in turn helps with all sorts of problems that plants can have. Rice production for upland rice went up 60% with this method. So all of these with rice are examples of the small changes that we can make where when they're applied to, 500 million farms or 1 billion farmers can make a really big difference. Talked about emissions, now I'm going to biodiversity. Agriculture is the largest driver of biodiversity loss in the world, and within that, deforestation is one of the major culprits. I mentioned before that 5.1% of global emissions come from smallholders. That breaks down to 3.4% for the actual production, 1.7% for deforestation. So we have quite a few projects where we work with farmers who are just sort of slowly encroaching into protected areas or forested areas to increase their yields. What we do is we provide essentially benefits to not do that. So in Liberia, that is a farmer field school program that includes 18 months of training in conservation agriculture, so no-till cover cropping methods. We train them in integrated pest management. We do participatory market system development with them. And eventually these communities will be eligible for emissions reduction payments through the RED Plus program that's being implemented. I'm going to skip a little bit because I'm running short on time. Pollinator conservation is also a part of our agricultural work at FFI. We find that it's a really nice way to get corporates to engage because it is a really, it's a true supply chain risk, depending on the commodity, of course. So in general, the true extent of the decline is definitely unknown, but there is more evidence coming out every month, every year, as to, for certain commodities, the possibility of achieving yield increases. I think cocoa is probably the most famous one. And we find that engaging with corporates on that really gets the attention that's necessary. And when you're doing pollinator conservation, you're doing conservation in general. Sadly, I am going to skip because I'm running out of time, but I want to mention that the core farmer challenges that we face are a lack of inclusion for the most marginalized people, and that sustainable practices, excuse me, they often have a cost. They almost always have a cost. Time, labor, money, opportunity, and farmers right now are not necessarily being compensated. They are when they work with FFI, they are when they work with a lot of people, but a farmer who is not supported is not being compensated for these costs, and that is the systemic change that we need. Yeah, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering panel questions.
Michelle, thank you very much. And Laura has also put a link to more information on FFI's incredible portfolio of work at this conservation and agriculture interface. So I wish we had more time to see all of that, all of those lovely slides. But as you flashed through them, you could see just the diverse landscapes and places where FFI is working on these issues. And I hope we'll be able to pick up on some of that as well in the conversation that follows. I'm really delighted, and she's appeared as I was about to introduce her, that we are going to be joined on the panel by Joanna Elliott. Jo Elliott is Senior Conservation Director at FFI and has been with FFI since 2013, leading a whole range of cross-cutting teams on conservation finance, enterprise, extractives, infrastructure, agricultural landscapes, science and design, and capacity and leadership. She fits all of that into her portfolio. Jo's going to be on the panel with the rest of the panelists. So Jo, thanks for being part of the question and answer process. As I expected with such a wonderful audience, we've already got a few questions to kick us off. So I'm not going to delay us any longer, conscious of time. Our first question is from Lara Birch, who's asking whether there are commercially viable ways that large-scale agriculture can enhance rather than damage the natural environment. And Michelle, maybe I'll ask you to pick that one up first, and then maybe see if the others have something to add on that.
Yeah, that's thanks, Bhaskar. That's a really tricky question because yes, there are, but they cost money. That's sort of what it comes down to. Yeah, I mean, we have enough land globally, and the industries, everyone has enough land to be producing sustainably. But as I mentioned, when it comes to smallholders, there is a cost involved. So yeah, it's the short answer is yes. It is possible, but it will cost money. And so the incentive has to be there. When I talk about it with smallholders, the incentive has to be there. I think, you could definitely say that for a corporate body too. The incentive has to be there.
Richard, just picking up on that, if it does cost money, does that mean the cost to the consumer at your end suddenly shoots up?
Yeah, which obviously is not sustainable, you know, if the consumer can't afford it. And this is the tricky balance. You know, we're trying to balance planetary sustainability with consumer sustainability alongside business sustainability, because we've got 28,000 mortgages that rely on us to do well and make money and pay tax and all the other stuff. What's interesting at the moment, so a company I admire hugely, Patagonia Provisions, they've just branched out into a food business, the outdoor model. And Yvonne Chouinard, the founder there, he's big into regenerative agriculture. And I was just having a look on his website, and he's selling 30 grams of basmati rice for $8.50. And I can't imagine any of our customers paying something like that. However, I'm sure it's a great product. So it's a constant conundrum. And I suppose the biggest conundrum of all, again, to go back to Yvonne Chouinard, is that there is no business out there that is actually sustainable in terms of a large scale business, because there's no business that puts back more into nature than it takes out. But I think what you can do is seek to fully understand the consequences of your supply chain, minimize, and then advocate. And that's where, you know, where we can, we're not saying we're a sustainable business, but where we do find a topic where we think we can take some corporate activism, like on palm oil, where we fully stepped out of palm oil, we thought that was a great way of highlighting the issues of deforestation and the plight of endangered animals such as the orangutan. So we were able to kind of leverage our platform to do something like that.
Great, thank you. Christina, do you have thoughts on this? How do we balance that tricky conundrum between commercial viability and the cost to the consumer?
I mean, there's so much discussion happening now about how do we factor in externalities. So coffee produced in a massive industrial scale, relying on machinery in Brazil, can't be compared to the coffee that you produce on a steep mountain slope over 1,000 meters in Guatemala. So how do we get consumers, and this is globally, not just in the global north or Europe and so on, but, you know, national consumers as well, to really appreciate what is needed to grow something well, what good looks like, what sustainable looks like, and why it matters to them and their children and their grandchildren. And that is starting, but there's some really interesting discussions happening about responsible consumerism and not putting all the burden on producing countries and smallholder farmers, but actually trying to share that across and along the value chain all the way to final consumer. The other point I just wanted to make is, and Michelle alluded to this, is you know, that sort of lead-in time needed as well for sustainable practices, and really being able to recognize what are the current barriers that smallholders and their communities are facing. You know, and some of them might be about access to good low cost inputs. You know, knowledge sometimes is there, but they don't have that security in order to be able to take that risk to prune their trees, their cocoa trees, that will enable them to produce more. So how do we understand that better and be able to, you know, work with them to compensate for that?
I'm going to pick up on a few questions that sort of are overlapping. So Veronica is asking, how soon can we hope to see sustainable agriculture as the norm in the UK and globally? David De Palma's similar sort of vein, why are sustainable agricultural practices not more widespread? How could these practices in particular be encouraged in Brazil to stop the Amazon rainforest destruction? And I think in a sort of related vein, there's a question from Nicholas Tanguy. Do you believe intercontinental trade of food and industrial scale farming has a future? Or are we really needing to switch to a much more local producing model, which is rewarding and attractive enough for those working in that sector? So I think there's a set of questions around how can we encourage that transition and why isn't it happening? What are the barriers, I suppose, at one level, but also what incentives could be put in place? Christina, why don't you start with that one, and I'll work up my way around the panel again. And Joe, you've probably got some thoughts on this one too.
I think, yes, as we were just discussing, understanding why in many cases, it's not that farmers don't know, it's just that they're not enabled to put into practice some of these, what they know will be a better practice. Where you are able to bring in information and awareness raising and send them to farmer field schools and so on to raise their understanding of what they need to do to have better, more sustainable agricultural practices. The risk that a farmer perceives on her or his land and being able to implement those is really quite, we can't underestimate that. There's also a lot of evidence that younger farmers are much more willing to look at innovation, look at technology. They're much more receptive to, the environmental sustainability angles and so on. But given that their parents are usually not able to let go of the land because they are still the breadwinner, and there is kind of poor titling, or there's definitely not provision for pensions and so on. It means that older generations aren't letting go of the land to the younger farmers who are more interested in different ways of cultivating, in taking advantage of technology and innovation that will solve and unlock some of these issues. So that's also something we need to factor in.
Michelle, there's reports sort of quite widely, just picking up on that last point, that the average age of a farmer is going up, and the younger generation actually are fleeing the rural areas to in search of employment and other opportunities. But in working as you do with sort of farmer field schools and various other such things, are you finding that there is this interest amongst a new generation of farmers who are looking at 21st century farming, if you want to call it that, with new eyes?
Yeah, I'll definitely back up what Christina said about in terms of people showing interest and engaging with more sustainable methods and practices. Definitely young people represent a lot of that. But yeah, exactly what you said is right too. Some young people grow up and want to farm, but especially if they grow up on a farm and there are opportunities elsewhere within their country, I think, it's understandable. Farming is really hard work. So it's not everyone's first choice.
Joe, let me draw you in on this.
Draw me. Oh, lovely open-ended question. I just thought I'd throw in a couple of comments, one related a bit to the previous question, which is just this, what Richard was talking about in terms of the role of government. I think we just, even though it's true that there is, there are real challenges in the global system that preclude us being able to lower prices and address all the externalities addressed by Christina. I think that the move towards really examining global footprints of companies and holding them to account, the opportunity for governments to come together and set a level playing field, even if there might be some price adjustments as a result, it's actually part of that systemic change. We can't afford any longer not to do that. So I think, it's really up to all of us to hold governments to account. But my point about this specific question, the thing I wanted to just remind people and draw to people's attention was, the Patagonia thing is an extreme, I think. What we see is an awful lot of action in the middle of really wise and like-minded corporates. And I think, Christina, of the work you were doing with us when you were at the Body Shop, of companies that really are willing to work along their supply chains to help add, it doesn't have to be a huge amount of value, add incremental value and that recognizes the social and biodiversity benefits of doing food and ingredient supply in a thoughtful way. I think I think that's one of our opportunities, is not to expect each of those initiatives to work at scale, but to replicate the number of companies willing to do that. Because if that could go up from the present hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, suddenly we've changed the system from within. So I just wanted to remind us of that one.
Thanks. And that somewhat picks up on the question that James Pilkington has just put in, which is, if biodiversity protection costs more at farm level, he says, it doesn't necessarily mean that consumer prices have to rise. Farmers can retain a greater proportion of the value of the final product. And at the moment, they generally only retain a minimal amount. How can we ensure farmers capture more of the value? Richard, that seems one for you to pick up.
Yeah, no, that's right. And across the supply chain, there's obviously different areas where costs can be borne, and you know, we work with farmers through to suppliers, through to our own profit margins, and then also the consumer. What I would say from the customer, and the customers are the kings and queens who ultimately dictate everything. The UK food retail market has to be one of the most competitive on the planet, and therefore it genuinely would be commercial suicide to put up prices at the kind of mass market level. And therefore, you know, I think we need more collaboration as an industry, and as Joe said, government as well. One thing I would just like to pick up on, one of the questions you read out, Bhaskar, was on Amazon deforestation. Actually, the biome to the south of that, the Cerrado, is particularly at threat at the moment because of deforestation to make way for soy. And this is an enormous problem indirectly, because soy is fed to pigs and chickens, which will find its way into our supermarkets. And, you know, I don't feel good about that, and I want to try and help. We've looked at it as an issue, and can we do a palm oil on Brazilian soy, and it's one of those unsolvable problems because of the lack of traceability. And I think the more traceability we have on issues like that, then once you can, there's a great saying in business, what gets measured gets improved, and that's genuinely what we need there. But finally, government intervention, and you know, we've got COP next year. We're leaving the European Union. What's our pitch to the world going to be? And as we seek to kind of forge new trade deals, I think that is genuinely the way to try and solve some of these bigger issues way up our supply chain that Iceland, as a 2.5% market player within the UK, really cannot. So, you know, could we link a future trade deal with Brazil to zero deforestation around soy, for example, and therefore some of these sort of scope 3 emissions, some of these nature destruction issues that we have up our supply chains, I think the issues genuinely are going to be diplomatic. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going to, I think, conclude the kind of round of questions with two which are really looking at technologies and crop varieties. Elsa Blankenberg, you mentioned that varieties are key for helping small producers improve yields. Does the intellectual property for such varieties lie with large organizations? Who owns the seed, as it were? Is there a way to make these varieties available for the commons so that they're actually accessible to the smallholder farmer? That's one side of it, which is, where's all this technology being developed? Where are new seed varieties coming from? And then Paul Baldwin's question, I think, is connected, where Paul's asking, what is the view of panelists on promoting the use of GM in agriculture? Many environmentalists and conservation campaigners are anti-GM. It often has negative reactions from consumers. Should GM play a greater role to increase agricultural yields and resilience and reduce the increasing pressure on nature? Or are there high unintended risks to biodiversity that are just too great for us to take? So something around the technologies that are available, both consumer and other reactions to those technologies, but also who owns these technologies? Where does the kind of, where do the profits rest with these new technologies? Lots of nods on the panel. Who wants to go first? Go on, Michelle.
Yeah, really great questions. One of my favorite topics. So yeah, I mean, varieties, it's a huge market. It's you know, there's Bayer, Monsanto creating varieties. There are research institutions creating varieties, and there's everything in between. So I would say that when it comes to making sure, especially when working with smallholders and people who are in, you know, marginalized situations, whatever they might be, it is incumbent upon an organization like FFI or whomever is providing the access to these inputs to ensure that we're providing inputs to something that will make sense for the farmer long term. That doesn't mean that we can't ever look at anything that's produced by a company, because there are companies out there, there are social businesses out there that are producing crop varieties. And I'm not talking about GM, I'm just talking about, you know, hybrid at most. These crop varieties, which, you know, the yield increases, only talking about the yield increases can be incredible, but the pest resistance, reducing agrochemical needs are also, you know, super valuable. So yeah, there's a huge spectrum of producers when it comes to different varieties of seed. And we just have to be careful about it. And in my opinion, it's the same thing with genetic editing. We, you know, it could go in any number of directions, and we just have to be extremely, extremely careful about it.
Richard.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I know we've got limited time. So the business was started by my mum and dad 50 years ago, and actually Dad in the early noughties was the first retailer anywhere in the world to ban GM ingredients from our own label products. He coined the phrase Frankenstein foods. And back then, I think it probably was more about Monsanto selling weed killer than it was about feeding the world. But I do feel now, to paraphrase, when the facts change, I change my mind. We need to look at the full arsenal of technology that's available to us, including geoengineering solutions such as GM. As we face into our climate emergency. So I agree with Michelle, we need to be very carefully and consider it carefully.
Christina, do you want to add anything to that?
I think we're running out of time, so I
Okay.
won't add anything to what Michelle and Richard said. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, any thoughts on the GM debate, or can I not draw you on?
The GM debate. I was just going to. There's a growing. I am appreciative of the rapidly growing volume of investment funds going into agri-tech. So this is seen as a business area with huge potential returns. I think helping make sure all of that is channeled in a kind of sustainable way and so on is going to be part of the solution to this problem. I'm as you all know, I'm an economist. I don't know anything about these things, but I hear, it's all to do with fungus proteins and insect proteins, and the scope for actually transforming the way our foods work appears to be really opening up over the next 20 years. And one can only hope and channel the sort of dual crisis of climate and biodiversity into making sure that works in as effective a way as possible.
And I think importantly, Joe, what you're saying is that technology of all sorts has to be part of the solution. It is definitely not uniquely the only solution. So I think to suggest that something like GM is somehow a magic bullet which will solve the world's food problems is problematic. But I think to rule out any technological intervention without having carefully thought through its implications is also probably not a good place to be, given the pressures that the planet already faces. I think we do need to draw to a close, sadly. It's been an hour that's gone very quickly. I just want to thank, of course, all three of the panelists who spoke, as well as Joe, for your interventions. I won't try and summarize, but I think what's become very clear is that, it's the systemic approach both to food production as well as understanding the food system. I mean, that's the terminology that people are increasingly using. But in thinking about this across FFI's portfolio, what kind of sets the organization apart, I think, is that it treats conservation as a systemic problem. It's not trying to compartmentalize conservation or food, and indeed with the challenges of climate change, any of those issues as though they're hermetically sealed off from each other. And really looking into the future, we have to look at these as multifunctional problems, production systems, consumer systems, supply chains, the links that connect people as farmers, as producers, as well as consumers who, at the end of the day, are the people for whom food is being produced. And I think the work that you're leading in FFI is a sort of signal of trying to see the world in those interconnected spheres rather than sealed off from each other. I'm really pleased that we were able to pull together such a fantastic panel. I'm grateful for the opportunity to chair the discussion. I know this is just the tip of the iceberg. So I encourage you to look at the links that are shared in the chat, and thank the audience for participating. And thank you very much for all of your contributions.